Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode we enter the musical world of trolls in the latest from Dreamworks Animation. The trolls are a happy race of creatures led by Kendrick's Princess Poppy that enjoy nothing more than to sing, dance and hug, but one of their massive parties draws the attention of their feared enemy, the Bergen, who steal many of them back to their kingdom. Now Poppy, determined to leave no troll behind, turns to the help of Bergen's survivalist, Branch, voiced by Timberlake, the only cynical troll, to help her rescue her friends before they become dinner. And maybe along the way, Poppy will teach Branch to find happiness once more. Trolls is based off the popular Danish toy invented in the 1950s that periodically has become a fad around the rest of the world, including during the 80s and 90s, where most viewers probably get the nostalgia of them from. And the design of the doll is quite iconic, with its little round face and its long, oversized brushable hair in a variety of different colours. That doll has actually waned in popularity in recent years, but here comes Dreamworks Animation to bring them to a whole new generation. And it speaks volumes about just how confident Dreamworks is about this property that they've been developing since at least 2010, that in 2013 they bought it outright. They now own all the non-Scandinavian rights to the Trolls property, so they have all the merchandising rights to this film. However, when the teaser trailer was released, it was met with an overwhelming chorus of hatred, and understandably so, because it was one of those trailers that was less of a coming attraction and more of a threat. I am pleased to report that this movie is not nearly as bad as that trailer implies, although it is still pretty obnoxious, and certainly when on comparing it to movies based off of toy lines, it's nowhere near the quality of the Lego Movie, which is almost certainly what it aspires to be. But then again, so does most animated films aimed at children these days. The Trolls themselves have undergone a major design overhaul in this new incarnation. They're now bright, colourful blobs, and the only thing they really have in common with their classic design is their long hair that they can extend and retract at will, and they tend to use it to either swing around or like a whip, for instance. I did get a little bit of a chuckle in the pre-title sequence. When the trolls escape from their tree, the decoys they leave behind are wooden hand-carved versions of the original dolls. That was an amusing touch. In terms of their personalities, they're very, very happy-go-lucky. They seem to be constantly having these huge musical numbers, and on their wrist they've got little flowery watches that light up on an hourly basis to remind them to all hug each other. They're extremely sugary and positive, and kids are going to absolutely adore them. It's very much aimed with the younger audience in mind. You can pretty much tell that because before even the title appears, there's a Minions-esque butt shot. However, if you're an adult, or if your age reaches into double figures, you'll probably find them very overbearing and exhausting. I just couldn't warm up to the trolls. I found them very, very tedious to be around, especially because none of them are especially well characterised. They all are of the sort of mentality of, oh, we'll give them one distinct character trait, that's how you identify them. So look, there's the James Corden one with his little pet thingamajiggy. There's the DJ one, voiced by Gwen Stefani, that has almost no lines in the movie. And that one's the Diamondy one. This is very much embodied by Kendrick's Princess Poppy, who is this bright pink cutesy poo, we can do it troll that leads everyone else. I have to admit, it's not like it isn't self-aware, it knows just how annoying the trolls are. There are jokes about that in universe, but even with that said, I did find them rather grating. And Kendrick herself, who I normally like, I found her a little bit irritating in this movie. I don't think that's entirely her fault, that's the way the character is directed. It's just that the character at certain points in the movie comes across as just being a little bit bratty. And most of the jokes about how annoying the trolls are come from Branch, Justin Timberlake's character, who you can easily identify because he's the only grey troll. He's just consumed by negativity, which is why all the colour has been sapped away from him. But for most adult audiences, they'll probably gravitate towards him because he's the only troll that's speaking sense. You see, at the beginning of the movie, They're celebrating their exile from the Bergens, their mortal enemies who don't feel joy except for when they eat trolls, which they have at this huge ceremonial festival called Trollstice. And the trolls made their escape from them on that day 20 years ago. And they're having this big, huge party to celebrate that anniversary. And he says to them that maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't be having this huge party in case, I don't know, a Bergen spots us, considering that there are people trying to eat us, and maybe, just tone it down a bit. But oh no, apparently he's the bad guy for saying that. Despite being the voice of reason, despite the voice of common sense, oh no, let's throw this huge party that can be seen from miles away, including fireworks. He lives like a recluse, he has this underground lair where he's stockpiled everything in case of an attack. It's a character that occasionally goes a little bit too far with the sort of wacky over the top, I saw at my own sweat. But most of the time he's just being cynical, and that actually got a couple of chuckles from me, because it was basically what I was thinking at that precise moment. And Timberlake, he does actually manage to make this character quite charming in his own way. He has enough charisma to pull this kind of role off. He doesn't come across as entirely being a stick in the mud. On a story level, Trolls is remarkably basic. Even for something that is aimed at very, very young children, it's incredibly straightforward. The trolls are kidnapped, we have to go to the Bergen King to get them back. That's pretty much the movie. And in between, their sort of journey that takes up much of the first half is relatively uneventful. Not very much stands in their way. There's a couple of little moments of peril, but for the most part, the conflict seems to be coming from Poppy and Branch's own different personalities. Of course, the obvious will they, won't they of what's going to happen between them. It's telling just how little sort of anything there is to this story, that they actually reach their destination about 50 minutes in, and the rest of the movie has to stall itself with this extended subplot about a Bergen servant played by Zooey Deschanel who has a crush on the young king, voiced by mintz-plasse, and she gets relationship advice from the trolls that become her wig. And so it essentially morphs into this extended riff on Cinderella, complete with a missing roller skate, and it just feels like the movie's taken this bizarre turn in a completely different direction, that it's suddenly become this weird romantic comedy. It's very, very odd. If you really look closely, there are a couple of little things that look like story threads that have been mostly abandoned. For instance, there is a king troll, King Peppy, voiced by Jeffrey Tambor, and he's the one that led all the trolls in their escape in the opening sequence. And he's getting on a bit now, and when the Bergen attacks, he starts clubbing at her foot, and he keeps going, bad Bergen, bad Bergen, bad Bergen. And he has to be rescued by his daughter, because obviously that's not going to do anything. And you think to yourself in that moment, hang on, is he going senile? And that seems to be implied a little bit, because at one point he actually says, I'm not the troll I used to be. And of course we never mention that again after that point. We never mention it at all. But it's understandable why so little regard's been paid to its narrative, because the entire movie is focused around its songs. This is a movie that really wants to be called charming and cute, but it's far too cynically calculated to be either of those things. It feels like a vessel to push its own merchandising, either toys or the soundtrack album for older audiences. And it feels like you're being hit with a succession of chart-ready pop song covers. If you thought that Home, Dreamworks' previous film from last year, was basically a succession of montages set to Rihanna songs, you haven't seen anything yet. And the song choices are kind of weird in this movie, in that a lot of them are older songs that the younger target audience won't be familiar with in the slightest, or of their significance. So you've got weird things like Lionel Richie's Hello being covered in this movie, or Gorillaz' Clint Eastwood being sampled for the Bergen world, as opposed to outright covered like everything else. And unusually, despite the fact that Justin Timberlake serves as the executive music producer, his character Branch doesn't sing until the final portions of the movie, so really the star of the soundtrack is Anna Kendrick. And Kendrick does a superb job when it comes to the musical numbers. I actually quite like some of the covers that they've done in the film, despite how weird some of the choices are. There's a scene where Poppy starts singing Simon & Garfunkel's The Sound of Silence, and it surprisingly works quite well. I actually wouldn't have minded hearing a full version of that song, as opposed to just a little sample of it that they use here. Kendrick's best moment on the soundtrack is easily the song Get Back Up Again, and I think that's partially because it's probably one of the most inspired moments in the film, just generally that sequence where Poppy ventures out on her own against the somewhat unusually graphic and disturbing landscape that the trolls happen to live in. That is actually quite a funny joke in of itself, and she's just relentlessly just fighting up against it, just bursting out of monsters' mouths and things like that. It's genuinely quite creative, but Kendrick's performance of that song and its relentless perkiness, just her voice becomes increasingly strained, especially in the final lyrics of the song, and that adds a real welcome comic touch the film is generally lacking elsewhere in combination with its visuals. It's one of the few times where the music and the visuals actually line up perfectly with each other and shows just how this could have worked in better hands, for example. And it's not like none of the songs are effective. In fact, when Timberlake does finally actually contribute to the soundtrack himself, it does prove to be quite powerful. There's a reason why the advertising campaign has highlighted the Timberlake cover of True Colours, for example. Even though that's a sequence that happens fairly late in the movie, and it's fairly pivotal, in fact, that moment is genuinely really beautiful and really effective and moving on its own terms. It doesn't really work in the rest of the narrative because I don't think the movie has nearly enough substance to justify that sequence, and it's just a shame that the rest of the movie doesn't capture just how beautiful that moment is in its own microcosm. And of course, let's not forget Can't Stop the Feeling, that song that you've been hearing constantly for the last several months, which turns out to have been for the Trolls soundtrack. The version that's in the film proper is not actually the version you've been hearing with Timberlake solo, it's actually a full cast rendition. But even still, it's a really annoyingly earwormy, toe-tappy song that I end up having caught in my head. So it's not like I hated all the songs on the soundtrack, but I do think it's a very mixed bag, and I do think it feels like something that would actually work better outside of the film than it does with the movie itself. And it makes sense to a certain extent, because I realise the focus on Kendrick on the soundtrack feels like another canny decision, because what they're clearly trying to do is they're trying to have another Pitch Perfect here. This movie is not only designed for very young audiences, it's designed for that particular audience. The people that made the Anna Kendrick Cup song a success, they desperately want to do that with the singles from this soundtrack. On an animation level, the movie looks fantastic, as per usual for Dreamworks Animation. You can clearly tell that a lot of attention has been paid to building the world of both the Trolls and the Bergens. Even though the Bergen world is very grey and monotone, it's still interesting to look at, although some of the most arresting visuals are in the land between these two places, especially when it's featured in Get Back Up Again, for example, with the big floating eyes, for example. In terms of the movie's 3D presentation, it does get a little bit of a boost from that. DreamWorks always likes to play towards that format, either throwing characters towards camera or having flying sequences. There's less of that in this movie, but it still makes the movie pop a little bit more. My real bugbear with the animation, though, is more towards the character designs. There's something about DreamWorks' recent films where they've gone towards character designs that are a little bit unusual and asymmetrical, and it doesn't really work The Bergens are designed to be ugly, and they are, but the trolls, I found them weirdly off-putting as well. There's something about their overly rounded features that I just found a little bit weirdly creepy. However, like the starry voice cast, including John Cleese as the Bergen King in the opening sequence, because apparently he doesn't turn down any voice rise offered anymore, it feels like the work of the animators has been squandered on this hugely undeveloped, paper-thin script. And it especially shows itself at the very end of the movie when what is supposed to be the film's climax suddenly throws in its epilogue into the final bars of the song. It feels like the movie still has 5 to 10 minutes to go, and then it suddenly feels like it's just rushing to just go straight into the credits. It's incredibly jarring and abrupt. Trolls is definitely not the worst thing that Dreamworks Animation has come out with in their very mixed filmography, but it's certainly on the level of something like Home or Turbo. And honestly, the best way to describe it is imagine those dance party sequences that virtually every single animated film has to include by law apparently these days, and then imagine that as a 90-minute feature. Trolls isn't completely terrible, but it's very uninspired next to the Lego Movie. A garish, sugary sweet concoction, it's less of a film that is an excuse to sell merchandise and chart-ready pop song covers. Even for a movie clearly aimed at the youngest viewers, the story is barely developed, merely there to tie one song to the next. Kids may well lap up the hyperactivity, but world-weary adults likely won't, despite the odd joke that lands. And even though the film has some impressive visuals, and some of the musical numbers are genuinely effective, the characters are unappealing in design and personality regardless of the cast. It's a great big disco bulb with a film that's completely empty at its core, content at being thoroughly mediocre in a year of far better, more ambitious animations than this one. Coming up soon, Alexander Skarsgård and Michael Pena are breaking the law and getting away with it in War on Everyone. Ken Loach rallies against inequality in I, Daniel Blake, and Amy Adams and Jake Gyllenhaal are Nocturnal Animals. But until then, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.